From SiriusXM's Doctor Radio, this is Coronavirus. Everything you need to know now.
From Doctor Radio Reports, here's Dr. Mark Siegel.
Hands down the top reporter reporting on COVID in the country today. Very difficult to do because she gets a lot of flack, as I do, but her reporting has been consistently excellent and often ahead of the curve. She introduced to me the idea that you can actually look at a preprint and figure something out, and then, the next week it's in Science or in Nature. That's Apoorva Mandavilli, reporter for the New York Times, focuses on science and global health, 2019 winner of the Victor Cohn Prize for Excellence in Medical Science Reporting. My prediction's going to get a lot of awards from this pandemic. Founding editor-in-chief of Spectrum, an award-winning news site on autism science, co-founded Culture Dish, an organization dedicated to enhancing diversity in science journalism, founding chair of the Diversity Committee for the National Association of Science Writers. The list will go on. Apoorva, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So look, over the last week, you've been the singular most important voice on something that's puzzling people, which is Pfizer coming out and saying, you may need a booster. Now, the way they're saying that is the part of the problem, because you've been reporting on this, and your articles on this are excellent, and a lot of people have jumped off from that. So what is your take on this with Israel, with Pfizer, with the question of boosters, who gets them, do people need them? What do you have to say?
I think it's very clear now that the vaccines do their job really well, especially for severe illness and hospitalization and death. And all the data so far are indicating that we probably will not need boosters in the foreseeable future. And that's what all the experts that I've been talking to have been saying. I know that there's this data coming from Israel, but the thing that gets left out a lot, I think, is that the vast majority of those infections are asymptomatic. And the ones that aren't are often in people who are really elderly and have, immunocompromised in some way, some sort of condition. And that is probably the subgroup that might need a booster. But for the rest of us, the vast majority of people in this country should not need boosters anytime soon.
Completely agree with that, and partly because I read you, but I completely agree with that, with the science that you've brought out, which is another main topic. I'm going to get back to the issue of immunocompromised people in this in a minute, because you've written about that too. But I want to talk about the immunity factor, which you've written a lot about, the idea of what immunity you get from being fully vaccinated with a BioNTech, Pfizer, or Moderna vaccine. What does your immunity look like, and why, therefore, are you predicting that it lasts?
Yeah, so I've written a couple of these stories recently, and I have to tell you, the science behind it is so cool, but I won't nerd out too much on you.
Go ahead, Dr. Radio.
Well, it's basically what they've been showing is that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines set off this sort of immune reaction in your body that scientists have never really been able to look at very closely with other infections, but with COVID, just because of the sheer numbers and the interest and the research money available, they have been able to. And now they have the techniques to do it too. And what they've seen is that the vaccines start off this immune response that is still going so strong 4 months later, in which the immune cells that you really need to be able to fight the virus are still training and figuring out how to become more and more sophisticated to fight the virus. They become better and better at recognizing variants of the coronavirus. So that is something that we hadn't fully realized until these studies came out. And now, knowing that, the scientists are predicting that immunity should last a really long time.
Are you then suggesting that the original idea of retooling the vaccine a year or two from now, whatever that timetable ends up being, to specifically hone in on specific variants that are emerging, may not be necessary?
I think, yeah, that's what I'm suggesting for the moment anyway. It does seem like we won't need that. I mean, I think it's not a bad idea to have a backup plan. And I think Pfizer is right to start exploring that, because you don't want to start exploring that after there's a problem. But it doesn't look like we're going to need it for these variants. What I've heard from experts I've talked to is that if we end up needing a booster, it'll be for a variant that we haven't seen yet. That's much worse than Delta and Lambda and Beta and everything else we've seen. At the moment, all the variants that we have are susceptible to the vaccine.
And by the way, one of the reasons I'm disturbed about the way that it's been handled, this announcement, and you've been as usual a counterforce to misinformation, is that of course people seize on it and say, you see, the vaccine's not as good as I thought. That's part of the disinformation campaign. How difficult or frustrating is it to counter that? I mean, me as a practicing physician, I'm used to the risk-benefit analysis. I do it every day. But every time something comes out, somebody hypes it and it interferes with vaccine compliance.
It really does. And there's a couple of different ways it plays out. There's the way that you just described, which is people see this information and they say, oh, the vaccines are no good. I don't want it anyway. But there are also people who like the vaccines, who believe in the vaccines and have been vaccinated, who say, you know what, I want the booster. If there's one, I'm going to line up first. Meanwhile, there's actually no need yet. And this is where the companies come in, with their statements and their press releases. It's really important for people to remember that companies have a different agenda and a different bottom line. They are there to make a profit. They're not there to think about the public health good. And that the decisions about whether there will be a booster and when and who will get it and when, all of that is made by the FDA and the CDC for a reason. We don't trust Pfizer to make the decision on when the boosters will be given out. So I think it's really important for people to pay attention to what the scientists are saying and what the federal agencies are saying, and much less to what Pfizer says.
Dr. Fauci said to me on the radio that people are waiting for more data. He says, well, I don't know what data they're waiting for. 300 million doses have been given out. So we have plenty of data on safety and efficacy at this point, and you're teasing out some additional data about growing immunity over time, which is really, really exciting. What about the Delta variant? What are your thoughts about it?
Well, there's no doubt that the Delta variant is a little bit of a scarier beast than the original one. It seems much more contagious, maybe double as contagious as the original virus. And it does have some ability to escape the immune system, but less than Beta, which is the variant that we saw in South Africa. And the vaccines still do really work. I do think that we will probably see more breakthrough infections with Delta than we will with the original virus, simply because Delta is more contagious. And there are still a lot of unvaccinated people in this country. And when numbers start to go up, which they have already started to, there's more cases now, more hospitalizations, more deaths nationwide, but also specifically in some states, we will start to see more and more infections. And some of those, statistically, will be people who have been vaccinated, who've been in close contact with someone who's infected. The vaccines are really, really good at preventing serious illness and hospitalization, but they are not as good at preventing infection. So we will probably see some infections with Delta.
One more question on Delta is, I'm very disturbed about L.A. County's numbers, 1,000 new cases a day. It looks like it's tilting younger, under 50, hospitalizations. Fauci hinted at that he thinks that Delta may even be a little bit more pathogenic, in addition to obviously way more contagious or easily transmissible. What are your thoughts about LA and what they're going through?
I think, there are a lot of states and counties that react much more conservatively than others, and they are right to be cautious. They are right to worry about their people. But I think the idea that somehow Delta is going to tear through a population, regardless of whether people are vaccinated or unvaccinated, is not quite right. The experts that I've talked to have said, if you are in an area with very low cases and infections, you probably don't need a mask. But if the numbers really start to go up very high, you may want to be like people in LA and the rest of California. You may want to mask up when you're indoors, because you may still get infected, and, you won't get very sick, but you probably don't want to get infected anyway, regardless.
What do you think about schools and some of the issues, the new guidelines coming out from CDC on masking? Really, the guidelines weren't about masking. It got a lot of attention. I wrote about it. But the guidelines were really about, we're going to open the schools, period. If you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask. If you are unvaccinated, you do. By the way, there's the other caveat there, which is that if you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask, provided that you can maintain 3 feet of distancing, is really what they're saying. But what are your thoughts on these guidelines?
I think they've really come out very strongly in favor of schools and are basically saying schools should be open no matter what. I think that's right, given the information that we have about the low risk for kids. We think we know enough about that now. I do think that the masking will get a little trickier as we go forward. They've left a lot up to individual states and counties And some school districts are going to struggle to figure out exactly how to change the policies as their numbers go up. This is the same kind of thing that happened earlier in the pandemic. And, there's a sort of natural tension here because the CDC can't really set policies for a whole country when the rates are so variable. You've got 7 states with most of the cases, and the cases are lower everywhere else. So it makes sense that they would leave it up to the local areas, but it does put the onus on school districts to figure out what to do. My perspective on it personally is that it's not a big deal to wear masks. My kids are very used to wearing masks now. So if they need to wear a mask, regardless of whether everybody around them is vaccinated or not, why not? It'll keep them safe.
I'm for it. Actually, I think it should be, recommended. The next question, of course, is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine took another perceptive hit with 100 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome that may or may not be linked to the vaccine. Historically, probably is linked to the vaccine. But again, this vaccine hasn't had the kind of compliance rate that we were hoping for because of the blood clot story. So what's your take on how this being messaged and perceived?
I mean, this is really the death knell for J&J. I feel like that vaccine, we've just had one problem after another, whether it's the blood clots, whether it's the problem with contamination and the factories that were making the vaccine, and now this Guillain-Barré syndrome. There has been just one too many reports of problems with the vaccine. And I do think that if anybody was on the fence about which vaccine to get, they're going to opt for the mRNA vaccines, which is a real shame, right? Because the J&J vaccines have a lot of advantages in the sense that it's like easily stored, it's one shot, it's very easy access for people who can't get themselves to a vaccination center twice because of their job or medical conditions or anything else. So it's troubling because, 100 cases is still very, very small. And the other thing I want to mention is that, as you briefly said, it's not entirely sure that all of those 100 cases are really from the vaccine. We don't know that for sure yet. The CDC usually reviews these cases and investigates them and then comes to a conclusion. But this time, the FDA has taken an action, and from what I know, from having talked to people who know about what happens behind the scenes, the CDC has not really been involved in this. So I would wait to see what the CDC says about how many cases are really connected. It's possible that all of them are and that this warning is warranted. It probably is. But we still have to look at the numbers overall and 100 cases out of how many million doses given out. So those are all important considerations for people. But I can't help but feel that most people who are thinking about getting one will be discouraged by this.
I think I see another article coming out here because FDA is now involved with tracking vaccine safety too. They've come up with an organization called BEST that looks at this, and they have been involved with this. But again, it hasn't been shown. In terms of testing, Apoorva, what do you think about tracking asymptomatic cases, which CDC has stopped doing? Do you think we're not testing enough anymore?
Well, I think we should still be testing just to see who is infected because we don't know 100% that people who are infected but who've been vaccinated don't transmit to others. Most likely they don't, but I do think it's important to at least have that information. It makes sense that the CDC isn't going to overreact and track every single case, but right now, for example, with reports of Delta and some speculation that maybe Delta causes more breakthrough infections, it's helpful to have information to see, okay, this is how many breakthrough infections you see with Delta versus with the original virus. And Delta does seem to maybe transmit more in a breakthrough infection than the original virus. Those comparisons can't happen if no numbers are being collected. So I think for the general public, if you just think about what should you be doing, should schools be testing, should sports teams be testing, it really depends on what you're trying to do. Rapid testing, which is really what's going to pick up a live infection, with high amounts of virus, that will help contain any transmission that's going on from vaccinated people. But do we all need PCR tests all the time? Not really.
We only have a minute left. Could you just give us a little sneak peek of your next story?
Oh, I have a story that is fairly broad, looking at the Delta variant and what we can expect as a country over the next few weeks and months from the Delta variant and how it's going to play out in areas that are vaccinated versus areas that aren't.
How about difficulty you have? Again, 1 minute about difficulty in people giving you unfair feedback, social media. How's that going?
I've learned to ignore it. A few months ago, I would have answered that differently. I think social media was really tough for me for a while. And I have learned some lessons these last few months, and I learned how to look away and walk away rather than engage and, take even more abuse. So it's been a good learning experience that way.
I'm a huge fan of yours. 30 seconds on where we're heading.
We are heading to a country that is going to look very different based on where you live, which community you live in. It's going to be two Americas. If you're vaccinated and you're around people who are vaccinated, you'll be living a very different life than if you're not. And I would say if you're not vaccinated, go out and get one right now.
Please listen to Apoorva Mandavilli, star-winning reporter for the New York Times, focusing on science and global health. What a great pleasure, honor, always to have you on the show, Apoorva. Thank you for joining us today on Dr. Radio Reports.
Thanks very much.
Get facts, not fear, from SiriusXM's Dr. Radio, presented by the leading experts from NYU Langone Health. To learn more about Dr. Radio, including shows and schedules, go to SiriusXM.com/Dr. Radio.